When I asked him to massage my neck that evening, I truly didn't mean anything by it. At least, I convinced myself I didn't. My husband was asleep upstairs, as usual, TV humming, mouth half open, lost in another evening of nothing. And there I was, with a pinched muscle and no one to care. Except him. The boy who technically wasn't mine, but had been living in our house for months. The one who smiled quietly when I passed by. The one who offered help without asking questions. He stood behind me, his hands warm on my shoulders, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a flicker. Not lust. Not love. Just attention. My skin noticed his fingers more than it ever noticed my husband's. And in that moment, I realized I had missed being noticed. His thumbs pressed gently beneath my collarbones, and I knew I should have stopped it. I knew. But instead, I let it happen. I let the moment grow thick around us like summer heat, heavy and silent. And that was the first mistake. Or maybe the second. Because the first might have been marrying a man who eventually stopped touching me altogether. Or perhaps the real mistake hadn't happened yet. Perhaps that was still coming. Either way, that massage changed everything. So before I take you through what followed, before I tell you how the lines blurred, how the nights got quiet and dangerous, and how I stood at the edge of something I never thought I'd consider, let me ask you something first. Have you ever done something small, innocent even, that slowly turned into something enormous? Something irreversible? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and tell me, too, have you ever crossed a line you didn't even see, until it was too late? It started with pain in my neck. A tight knot that ran from the base of my skull down into my shoulder, twisting itself into every task I tried to complete that day. Cooking, cleaning, even just turning my head, everything hurt. My husband, as always, was upstairs, buried under headphones and emails, a different kind of pain altogether. I asked him to help me rub it out. He didn't even lift his eyes from the screen. You should stretch, he said. I almost laughed. I should stretch. Of course. So I took 2 ibuprofen, ran warm water over a towel, sat with it on my neck, and tried not to think too hard about how many nights we had spent like this, me with my pain, him with his distance. I didn't blame him. Not entirely. After 20 years, marriages lose their color. But I had hoped ours would gray gently, not vanish altogether. Later that evening, I was in the kitchen reaching for a glass when I felt it pinch again. I winced and muttered under my breath. That's when he walked in. You okay? He asked. His voice was casual, but his eyes weren't. I turned slowly and tried to smile. It's nothing. Just my neck. Old age. He stepped closer, hesitated, then said, You want me to try something? I used to help Mom with hers. Baseball injury. She swore I had magic hands. It was a joke. I laughed. Too loudly. But then I nodded. Okay. Just for a second. I sat on the stool, resting my arms on the countertop. He stood behind me, and for a moment, there was only the sound of the fridge humming and the faint rustle of the trees outside. Then his hands touched my shoulders. Firm but gentle. Confident. He moved slowly, as if listening to my body more than I was. His thumbs worked the knot carefully, and my breath caught when he found the exact spot that hurt. He noticed. Right here, he asked, not moving. Yes, I whispered, too quietly. For a few moments, I let myself relax. My eyes fluttered shut. The air felt warm, heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. My pulse tapped against my ribs like a question I didn't want to answer. He moved slightly lower, along the edge of my shoulder blade. I flinched, not from pain, but but from the sudden realization that this was no longer just a massage. And yet, I didn't stop him. His fingers paused, sensing it too. We both stayed still, like animals in a forest hearing the same twig snap. I stood up too fast. "Thanks," I said, backing away. "That's enough." He stepped back as well, eyes down. "Sure. No problem." I walked upstairs and shut the door behind me, resting my back against it. My heart thudded in my chest, too loud for the silence. I wasn't sure what had happened, but I knew something had. And I was afraid of what it might become. Later, I lay in bed beside my husband, who was already snoring. The room smelled of old laundry and screen light. I stared at the ceiling, the pressure point in my shoulder now gone, replaced by a deeper ache, one I couldn't reach. The next morning, everything was normal. Too normal. He was in the kitchen pouring coffee. I greeted him with a light smile, careful not to linger. He smiled back politely. "How's the neck?" "Better," I said. "Thanks again." He nodded. "Anytime." I hated how innocent it sounded. How clean. Throughout the day, I replayed it. The exact moment when the air changed. When a line I didn't even know existed was approached, maybe even crossed. I told myself it was just gratitude. That I was reading too much into a kind gesture. But I knew better. There was a moment that lived in the pause between his question and my answer. That moment had shape, temperature, and weight. It had breath. At lunch, I caught myself checking my reflection in the toaster. I adjusted my shirt. I reapplied lipstick. Not for my husband. Not for anyone. Just to feel like a woman again. In the afternoon, he passed me in the hallway. I smelled his cologne, barely there, clean. Our shoulders brushed. It was nothing. It was everything. He looked at me for half a second longer than needed. I pretended not to notice. That night, I dreamed of nothing. Just the warmth of hands, the press of a thumb, the silence between two people who weren't supposed to see each other. When I woke up, my husband was gone. Off to work early. I lingered in bed longer than usual. I needed to think. Or maybe I needed to not think at all. Because the moment had passed, but the question remained, would I ever ask him to touch me again? And if I did, what would I be asking for, really? The next morning started as most mornings did. The scent of brewing coffee seeped through the cracks of my bedroom door. Birds chirped outside the window, their song too cheerful for the weight I carried. I sat up slowly, unsure of how I felt. My shoulder no longer ached, yet a different kind of tension now lived in its place, deeper, quieter, far more dangerous. I moved through the hallway cautiously, almost like I was sneaking through someone else's home. But it was mine. Still mine. The same photos on the wall, the same scuff on the floorboard near the stairs. Nothing had changed, except everything had. When I entered the kitchen, he was already there. He stood by the sink, rinsing a glass. The sound of running water, once mundane, now felt amplified. I caught his eyes for a fraction of a second. We both smiled, tight, polite. Like strangers pretending they'd never touched. He poured me coffee without asking. I nodded my thanks and sat at the table, wrapping my hands around the mug for warmth I didn't really need. He leaned against the counter across from me, arms crossed. "I have a study group this afternoon," he said casually. "I'll be back before dinner." I nodded again. "Sounds good." And that was it. The morning passed like a dress rehearsal of normalcy. Neither of us acknowledged what had happened. It was as though if we didn't name it, it would vanish. But silence has its own gravity. It pulls. As the day wore on, I tried distracting myself with chores. I scrubbed the bathroom tiles with unnecessary force. I rearranged spices in the kitchen cabinet. I dusted shelves that hadn't seen a cloth in months. But none of it made me feel better. None of it erased the way his fingers had lingered a little too long on my skin. Or the way I'd leaned back into him, if only for a breath. I caught myself checking my phone more than usual. For what, I didn't know. He rarely texted. We were still in the same house, after all. But my eyes kept returning to the screen, craving something I couldn't name. In the late afternoon, I walked past the hallway mirror and froze. I didn't recognize the woman staring back. Not fully. There was something in her eyes, something unsettled, almost guilty, but not regretful. Her blouse clung slightly to her side, a thin sheen of sweat from the relentless summer air. Her hair, unpinned, brushed lightly over her shoulders. Her lips looked fuller, like they remembered being noticed. I turned away quickly, heart stuttering. By the time dinner rolled around, my husband was home. He greeted me with a peck on the cheek, then muttered something about a stressful meeting and went upstairs to change. He didn't notice anything different. Not in the house, not in me. We ate in silence, the occasional clink of silverware the only sound between us. He asked nothing. I said nothing. It was our rhythm. Predictable. Harmless. Later that evening, I stepped out onto the back porch for air. The sky was streaked with orange and pink, the kind of sunset you want to memorize and forget at the same time. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe in something real. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. He stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, the other holding a glass of water. He didn't speak. Neither did I. For a moment, we just existed in the same space, the silence stretching long and taut between us. He stepped forward, hesitant but deliberate. I didn't move. I wasn't sure if you'd be out here, he said, his voice low. I just needed air, I replied. He nodded. It's nice. We both looked out into the yard, at the trees swaying gently, the shadows growing deeper. He set his glass down on the table beside me and leaned against the railing. I keep thinking about yesterday, he said. I looked at him. I didn't mean to make things weird, he continued. It just happened. I waited. And I know I probably shouldn't have offered. I don't want to disrespect your space. Or your marriage. I looked away. It wasn't just you. He didn't answer. For a while, we said nothing more. The air between us wasn't charged like before. It was quieter now, more tentative. Like a fragile truce neither of us dared to break. Eventually, he turned to leave. As he reached the door, I spoke. We kissed. He froze. Yes, he said. We did. Then he stepped inside, and I remained alone, unsure whether I felt exposed or relieved. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay in bed listening to the hum of the ceiling fan, my husband's even breathing beside me, and the relentless spinning of thoughts in my own head. The kiss had happened. Simple. Final. Not passionate, not rushed, but real. I wasn't sure if I wanted more. I wasn't sure if I deserved less. Morning brought no clarity. At breakfast, the three of us sat together like we always did. Cereal. Toast. Newspaper. But everything felt off-kilter, like the room was tilted slightly and none of us noticed. When he stood to leave for class, he paused beside me. Have a good day, he said, softly. You too. Our eyes met for a breath, then he walked away. I felt his absence in the room before the door even closed. That day, I didn't clean. I didn't cook. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the window, watching clouds move without direction. My husband called out something from downstairs, asking about dry cleaning. I answered automatically. The motions continued, but my mind was elsewhere. Trapped somewhere between the echo of hands on my shoulders and the memory of lips brushing mine. Not romantic. Not sordid. Just undeniable. And the worst part? It wasn't regret that haunted me. It was how alive I had felt in that fleeting, stolen moment. The morning after was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Like the world had collectively agreed not to say anything, not to remind me of what had already happened. The sun came in through the kitchen window with its usual warmth, the sound of birds filled the air, and my husband sat at the table sipping his coffee, reading the news like any other day. I moved through the motions of breakfast without thought. Toast. Butter. Juice. Everything in its place, except my mind, which lingered somewhere else. Somewhere it wasn't supposed to be. My body was present, nodding and pouring and chewing, but my thoughts were trapped in that short, irreversible moment. We kissed. I glanced at him across the table, my husband, and tried to measure what I felt. Not guilt exactly. More like confusion. A muted ache. He looked tired, his brow furrowed not at me, but at something in the news. His shirt was wrinkled at the collar. He hadn't shaved properly. I wondered when I stopped noticing those things. I also wondered when he stopped noticing me. He didn't say anything about the night before. Of course, he couldn't. He didn't know. But even if he had sensed something was off, I doubted he would press. That had always been his way, avoid the uncomfortable, pretend everything was fine, and let time flatten any wrinkles. But I was no longer sure I wanted to be smoothed over. Later that day, I found myself folding laundry in the living room, a task I usually avoided. There was something strangely meditative about the rhythm, fold, smooth, stack. Each towel or shirt gave my hands something to do while my mind wandered. He passed by once or twice but didn't stop. He offered a polite "need help," which I declined. We were like two trains passing each other at a station, always moving, never touching. But then, hours later, as the sun began to dip, I saw him again. He was outside, shirtless, mowing the lawn. The late summer light made everything shimmer. His skin glistened with sweat, his back flexed with each movement. It was an image I wasn't prepared for. I tried not to look, but something in me did anyway. Not out of desire exactly. More like curiosity. Or maybe memory. There was once a time when I had been touched like that, noticed like that. I closed the curtain and turned away. Dinner was silent again. My husband spoke about work. I responded with nods and filler words. The meal was tasteless, but that wasn't new. The silence wasn't new either. The only thing that had changed was me. And him. The one who wasn't supposed to be part of this. After dinner, my husband retreated to his study. He always said he had emails to catch up on, but I knew it was just a way to disappear. I cleaned the dishes, dried them methodically, wiped the counters twice. And then, without meaning to, I wandered to the hallway. The door to the guest room, his room, was slightly open. Light spilled out in a narrow sliver across the floor. I stood there for a moment, unsure. Then I knocked, lightly. He opened the door almost immediately, as if he had been standing near it. His expression was unreadable, calm, maybe slightly surprised. "Hey," I said, my voice softer than I expected. "Can I come in?" He stepped aside. "Of course." I entered cautiously, my eyes scanning the room. It was tidy. A backpack rested in the corner, a few books on the desk, a hoodie draped over the chair. It felt temporary, like a space waiting to be abandoned. I began, but the words trailed off. He didn't press. He sat on the edge of the bed and waited. I remained standing. I wanted to talk, I finally said. About the other night. He nodded. Okay. It shouldn't have happened, I said quickly, before I lost courage. I mean, not like that. It was a moment. But I'm married. And you. I know, he said. And I don't want to make things uncomfortable. They already are, he said, not unkindly. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling slightly. I clasped them together to make it stop. I'm not blaming you, I said. I need you to know that. He didn't reply right away. Then, after a long pause, he said, "You looked sad." I wanted to help. That simple sentence hit me harder than I expected. Sad. That's how I looked. That's how I had felt for months, maybe years, without ever saying it aloud. I sat down slowly in the chair by the desk, exhaling a breath I didn't know I was holding. Do you ever feel like you're fading? I asked. He tilted his head. What do you mean? Like people see through you. Like your furniture. Useful, but invisible. He nodded once. Yeah. Sometimes. I looked at him then, not as a complication, not as a mistake, but as a person. Just another soul trying to navigate the blurred lines between need and restraint. I don't want this to be a thing, I said. I don't want it to become more. I understand. But I also don't want to lie. Not to myself. He looked down at his hands. Neither do I. We sat in silence for a while after that, not awkward, just still. Two people acknowledging something fragile and unspoken. Eventually, I stood. I should go. He walked me to the door. We didn't touch. We didn't even look at each other as I stepped back into the hallway. Back in my own room, my husband was still typing away at his computer. He barely looked up when I entered. Everything okay? He asked. Yeah, I said. Just needed to check something. He nodded and returned to his screen. And I lay down beside him, my body still, my mind anything but. I thought about everything that had been said. Everything that hadn't. And I wondered how long I could keep living in a house full of silences. The following days unfolded with a strange sense of stillness, like the eye of a storm that had yet to pass. Nothing more had happened between us, not physically, not verbally, but the quiet tension lingered in every hallway we crossed, every shared glance that held just a second too long. And still, life around us moved forward, ignorant of the emotional shift that had taken root beneath its surface. My husband continued his routine like clockwork. He left early, returned late, and filled the spaces between with the monotony of habit. He asked about groceries, bills, small household chores, but never once asked how I was. I suppose I stopped expecting him to. And yet, my mind was no longer at rest. The smallest things unsettled me now, the sound of a door creaking open behind me, the echo of footsteps on the stairs, the smell of his shampoo lingering in the bathroom. I had always thought myself composed, immune to temptation. But I was learning that loneliness could hollow a person out quietly, and that emptiness would welcome anything that filled it, even briefly. One afternoon, I stepped outside to water the plants. The sun was heavy and hot, beating down on the small garden we had planted seasons ago. The flowers were beginning to wilt. I stood there, watering the roots absently, when I heard his voice behind me. You missed a spot. I turned and saw him leaning on the porch railing, smiling gently, holding a glass of iced tea. I nodded, attempting a casual tone. Guess I'm a little distracted. He walked over, crouched next to me, and took the hose from my hand. "Let me help." I let him. And we stayed there, side by side, not talking, just working in tandem. I felt the sun burning my shoulders, the smell of wet soil rising from the ground, and the unbearable nearness of him as he reached across me to adjust the nozzle. It wasn't a touch. It wasn't even an intentional gesture. But it felt like one. Later, as I stepped inside to wash my hands, I caught a glimpse of us in the hallway mirror, me slightly flushed, him walking just a step behind. For a moment, it looked like a scene from another life. One where I was allowed to feel seen again. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air in the bedroom was stifling, thick with the heat of late summer. My husband snored softly beside me, completely unaware of the turbulence within me. I lay on my side, facing the wall, heart restless. I thought about the quiet moments with the boy in the garden. I thought about the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. And I hated myself for wanting to feel that again. By the time morning came, I had made up my mind to avoid him. Not out of guilt, but out of self-preservation. I needed space. I needed distance to remind myself who I was and what I had to lose. So I busied myself with errands, visited a friend I hadn't seen in months, spent hours walking aimlessly through the grocery store just to keep my feet moving. But even then, he was there, in the edges of my mind, in the ghost of a voice behind me, in the questions I refused to let form. That evening, as I returned home, I noticed his car was gone. I felt both relief and disappointment. I told myself I was glad. That space would be good for us both. I made dinner. My husband was running late. I ate alone, cleaned the dishes, and sat in the dim light of the living room, staring at the wall without really seeing it. The silence felt louder than ever. A while later, I heard the door open. He stepped in, backpack slung over his shoulder, hair slightly tousled, as though he had been driving with the windows down. Our eyes met for the briefest moment, and then he looked away. "Sorry I missed dinner," he said, dropping his keys in the bowl near the door. I nodded. "No problem." He disappeared into his room, and I sat there frozen. Something about his tone had changed. Or maybe it was me. Maybe I was just hearing what I hadn't wanted to hear all along, that we were drifting again, this time towards something neither of us could name or undo. The next morning, I found a note in the kitchen. Just a scrap of paper folded once, resting near the coffee maker. My name written in clean, familiar handwriting. Heading out early. Won't be home till late. Don't wait up. No explanation. No warmth. Just a wall where there used to be a window. I held the note in my hand longer than necessary, staring at the curve of the letters, wondering what they meant or didn't mean. That day felt endless. I wandered from room to room, unable to settle. I cleaned things that didn't need cleaning. I rearranged the linen closet. I sat on the bed, staring at the floor for what felt like an hour. By the time evening arrived, I was raw. And then, sometime after sunset, he returned. I was in the backyard, seated in the old metal chair near the garden, a glass of water sweating in my hand. I didn't hear the door open, but I felt him before I saw him. He stood at the edge of the porch for a moment, then slowly walked down toward me. The air between us was heavy again, but different now. Cautious. Guarded. "I didn't mean to be gone so long," he said. I nodded but didn't answer. I thought maybe space would help. Did it? I asked. He didn't reply immediately. Then, a little. Maybe. We sat in silence for several minutes. The only sound was the soft buzz of insects and the occasional rustle of trees. "I don't know what to do," I admitted. The words escaped before I could stop them. "I don't either," he said. And there it was. Honesty, raw and unfinished. I don't want to ruin things, I said. Not for you. Not for me. I don't want to disappear, he replied. Not again. We looked at each other then, truly looked, and I felt something shift. Not forward. Not back. Just shift. I stood. I should go inside. He didn't stop me. But as I reached the door, I heard him say, "It doesn't have to mean anything." I paused. My hand on the doorframe. I know, I said. But it already does. And then I stepped into the house, closed the door softly behind me, and leaned against it, breathing in the weight of choices not yet made, but already felt. The days that followed were filled with silence that was no longer neutral. It was tense, fragile, and crackling with the weight of everything we were not saying. I moved through the routines of the house like someone walking across ice, careful not to place her weight too heavily on any one thought, any one moment. But underneath the surface, I felt everything shifting. Something had been set in motion, and there was no turning it back. My husband, as usual, remained outside the core of it all. Present in body, absent in every other way. He left for work with a kiss on the forehead, the kind given out of obligation, not affection. He returned late, ate dinner, and retreated to the living room or his study. Sometimes I wondered if he noticed how far we had drifted. But if he did, he gave no sign of wanting to reel me back in. I stopped asking. That Friday, he came home early. It was rare. He stood in the doorway with a small smile and a bottle of wine in hand. I thought maybe we could have dinner together, he said. I blinked, surprised. Sure. He grilled something on the back porch while I made a salad in the kitchen. The sound of him moving outside felt foreign, like a guest in his own house. I caught glimpses of him through the window, focused, efficient. I remembered when I used to find that attractive. Now, I just felt distant from it. We ate outside on the patio table, the last light of the sun dipping behind the trees. He spoke about work, small annoyances, an upcoming project. I listened, nodding, offering questions here and there, but I was elsewhere. Not physically, but in every other way. Part of me kept scanning the house, wondering if he was listening. If he was even there. He wasn't. After dinner, my husband offered to clean up. Another surprise. I said nothing, just nodded and walked inside. I passed the hallway and found myself pausing near the guest room, his room. The door was half closed. I didn't hear anything, but something about the stillness behind it felt charged. Later that night, I stepped out onto the front porch. The air was cool and quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your skin. I sat down on the steps and looked up at the sky, wondering when everything had begun to unravel. Not just recently. Long before. I remembered the early days of my marriage, how we used to reach for each other without thinking. How a brush of the hand was a message in itself. We had once had rhythm, intimacy. But years had worn it down like waves over stone. Now there was only habit and convenience. I was still lost in thought when the door creaked behind me. I turned and saw him standing there, barefoot, holding 2 mugs of tea. I made too much, he said, offering one. I took it. Thanks. He sat beside me, not too close. We sipped in silence. I could hear the faint chirping of crickets, the rustle of a breeze through the trees. The night felt heavy, expectant. I saw you earlier, he said after a while. At the hallway. I looked over at him. I didn't mean to interrupt anything. You didn't. We fell into silence again. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't uncomfortable. It just was. Then he said, I keep thinking about that night. I do too, I said, more quickly than I should have. He looked at me, but I didn't meet his gaze. I don't know what to do with it, he admitted. Neither do I. And then, like some invisible thread had pulled us, we leaned toward each other. Not fast. Not hungry. Just inevitable. We kissed. There were no fireworks. No swelling music. It was soft. Brief. Real. And when it ended, we didn't speak. He stood and walked back into the house, and I stayed outside, staring into the dark, heart thudding in my chest like I had just confessed something without saying a word. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed beside my husband, staring at the ceiling, reliving the moment over and over. The kiss itself wasn't what haunted me. It was what it meant. That I had crossed the line I swore I wouldn't. That it wasn't just loneliness anymore, it was something else. The next morning, everything was ordinary again. The sky was blue. The birds sang. Coffee brewed. My husband read the news in his usual seat. But I wasn't the same. I moved slower. I watched my own hands, like they belonged to someone else. I avoided him all day. Not because I was ashamed. But because I didn't trust myself to not want more. That evening, he was in the kitchen again. We passed by each other, close enough to touch, but didn't. I felt his eyes on me as I filled a glass with water. I didn't look up. I couldn't. The glass trembled in my hand. Just slightly. But it was enough. I stepped out into the backyard, sat on the bench beneath the old oak tree, and closed my eyes. I thought about how something so small could change everything. A conversation. A glance. A kiss. I stayed outside until the sun began to dip. Until the lights inside the house glowed soft and golden through the windows. Until I could no longer pretend I didn't feel the shift. When I finally stood to go back inside, I realized something. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. About the parts of myself I had buried under years of doing what was right, of being what was expected. And now, with one simple moment, all of it had been unearthed. And I didn't know what I was going to do next. I woke up the next morning with a heaviness in my chest that I couldn't quite name. It wasn't regret. It wasn't shame. It was more like the weight of a decision I hadn't fully admitted to myself yet, pressing down in silence. My husband was already up and gone, the scent of his cologne lingering faintly in the air, a smell I once found reassuring, now reduced to a trace of routine. I moved slowly through the house, letting my feet guide me. The kitchen was quiet. The light filtered in through the blinds in soft, golden strips across the counter. I made coffee out of habit, poured it into my usual mug, and stood by the window, watching the leaves outside twitch in the breeze. Everything looked the same, but it all felt so different now. Like the entire house had shifted on its foundation. I hadn't seen him since the kiss. I had heard his door open once in the middle of the night, had felt the floorboards creak through the walls, but we hadn't spoken. We hadn't needed to. The silence had already said more than words ever could. The coffee turned cold in my hand. By mid-morning, I was reorganizing the pantry, wiping shelves that didn't need wiping. I needed something to do. My thoughts spun in circles, doubling back on themselves, trying to convince me it wasn't a big deal. That it was just a kiss. That people made mistakes. But that wasn't true, and I knew it. This wasn't a slip. It was a signal. Around noon, I heard the door open and close. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just listened. His footsteps passed the hallway and headed to the laundry room. A moment later, I heard the hum of the washing machine. Mundane, normal. I stayed frozen in place. Eventually, I heard him leave again. A door shutting, the soft rumble of his car pulling out of the driveway. Only then did I sit down. I didn't know what I had been expecting. A confrontation? An apology? A continuation? What I got was space. That afternoon, I went for a walk. It had been weeks since I'd left the neighborhood without a reason. I wandered past the rows of identical houses, the perfectly trimmed lawns, the occasional wave from a neighbor who didn't know me well enough to see past my polite smile. I ended up at the park without realizing it. I sat on a bench near the walking path, watching an older couple throw breadcrumbs to a cluster of birds. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Their rhythm was slow and familiar. There was comfort in that. But I couldn't help wondering if the woman ever felt what I felt. If she ever looked at her husband and thought, "Where did we go?" Back home, the hours passed slowly. My husband texted to say he'd be late, again. I responded with a simple okay and left it at that. I didn't ask where he'd be. I didn't want to know. It was almost dark when I heard the door open once more. This time, it wasn't my husband. I knew by the sound of the footsteps, by the way the door clicked shut more softly than usual. I was in the living room, pretending to read, the book resting open on my lap but my eyes not moving. He walked past the doorway without looking in. But I knew he had seen me. A few minutes later, I heard his door close. And I exhaled for the first time in hours. Dinner was quiet. My husband eventually came home, tired and preoccupied, his mind elsewhere. We ate at the kitchen island. He talked about some client problem he was dealing with. I nodded when expected, offered a few well-placed phrases of agreement, but none of it stuck. None of it mattered. Afterward, he retreated to the study, and I washed the dishes slowly, letting the hot water sting my fingers. The guest room light was off. The door closed. I went to bed early, hoping that sleep might bring clarity. It didn't. Instead, I lay awake, watching the ceiling fan spin in slow, hypnotic circles. The night pulsed with a quiet tension I couldn't escape. Everything felt close. Every thought, every sound, every question I had been avoiding. What did it mean that I had kissed him? What did it mean that I wanted to do it again? Was it desire? Or desperation? Or simply the echo of something that had been missing for so long, I no longer recognized it when it returned? I didn't have answers. Only the realization that something had opened inside me, something I couldn't close. The next morning brought a change in weather. Gray skies, soft drizzle. I opened the window in the kitchen and let the cool air drift in as I made breakfast. I liked the way it smelled, fresh, clean, like a reset. He came into the kitchen just as I was finishing. His hair was damp from the rain, his jacket slung over one arm. "Morning," he said, his voice even. "Morning," I replied. I offered him coffee. He accepted. We stood at opposite ends of the counter, mugs in hand, the space between us filled with everything unspoken. Finally, he said, "Are we okay?" I didn't look at him when I answered. "I don't know." He was quiet. Then he said, "I don't want to make things harder for you." "You're not," I said quickly. "It's not you." "Then what is it?" I paused. The words came slowly, one by one. "It's everything. It's the years. The silence. The way I stopped recognizing myself in this house." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. He understood. The rain picked up outside, a soft tapping against the windows. I listened to it, letting it fill the space where my voice had been. "I think I need time," I said finally. He nodded. "Okay." And that was it. He turned, walked away, and left me standing there with a cooling mug of coffee and a storm I couldn't name. By the time my husband came down, everything was back to normal. The kitchen was clean. Breakfast was made. I smiled and asked how he slept. He answered with a shrug and a glance at his phone. But inside me, everything was changing. And I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending it wasn't. The morning light came in through the curtains as a soft wash of gold across the bedroom wall. I watched it slowly stretch toward the foot of the bed, just as I had the day before, and many mornings before that. But this time, I felt different. Not because anything had changed overnight, but because I had finally stopped denying that something already had. Deep within me, a shift had solidified, quiet, invisible, but irreversible. My husband was already out of the house, leaving behind the usual signs of his routine, the faint trail of cologne in the bathroom, the unmade bed, and the soundless space where his voice hadn't been. I stayed in bed a while longer, listening to the ticking of the clock on the wall and the far-off hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. The world outside continued as if nothing had happened. And maybe, to the world, nothing had. But inside me, the noise wouldn't stop. I rose eventually, went through the motions of the morning. I washed my face, brushed my hair, dressed in clothes I didn't think too much about. I moved through the kitchen in silence, boiling water, slicing fruit, making coffee, pouring it into the same mug I always used. The house was still. Still enough to feel like a waiting room. It wasn't long before I heard him enter. The door shut with its usual soft click. His footsteps came through the hallway, slow but steady. I didn't turn to greet him. I couldn't. But I knew. I knew something would be different today. The air carried it. A quiet pressure that curled itself around my shoulders like a fog. I stared down into my mug as his presence filled the room behind me. "Hey," he said. I turned halfway, just enough to acknowledge him. "Hi." He didn't move closer. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed lightly, and studied me. I felt it, his eyes on the back of my neck, the space between my shoulder blades, the question that hadn't been spoken yet. I set my mug down and turned to face him fully. "We can't keep doing this," I said. He nodded once, as if he'd already expected it. "I'm not trying to start something," he said. "But I also can't pretend it didn't happen." "Neither can I." We stood there for a while, two people tethered by something that was never meant to exist, yet now couldn't be undone. There was no hostility. No confusion. Just resignation. And something softer, acceptance, maybe. "It's not just about that kiss," I said. "It's what it brought up. What it reminded me of. What it made me admit to myself." He looked at me then, not in question but in understanding. He wasn't asking for anything. That was what made it harder. "I haven't felt anything like that in years," I said. I didn't even realize how numb I'd become. He stepped closer, only slightly. Not enough to breach anything, but enough to make it feel real. "I think I just wanted to matter to someone," I added. His voice was quiet when he answered. "You do." The words hung between us like a fragile thread. The rest of the morning passed in fragments. He left the kitchen first, giving me space. I finished my coffee, washed the dishes slowly, dried them one by one. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't open a book. I didn't scroll through my phone. Instead, I went upstairs and changed clothes, something soft, something not meant for anyone else. I tied my hair back and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the framed photo on my nightstand. It was from years ago. A trip up north. The three of us smiling by a lake. Back when things were simple, or at least I believed they were. That afternoon, a storm rolled in. Heavy clouds gathered overhead, thick and swollen with rain. The light in the house dimmed as the sky turned to slate. Thunder rumbled in the distance, not yet close but enough to make the walls feel tighter. I moved through the rooms slowly, checking windows, closing them against the wind. When I reached the guest room, I paused. His door was cracked open. I hesitated, then gently pushed it wider. He was sitting at his desk, staring at a notepad, pen unmoving in his hand. He looked up when I stepped inside. "They said it might storm all night," I said. He glanced toward the window. I heard. We didn't speak for a while. The sound of distant thunder filled the gaps. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted. "Me neither," he replied. "I'm scared." "Of what?" "That I'll keep doing this. Keep needing something I can't have. You're not the only one." He stood slowly, walking to the other side of the room. The distance between us felt smaller than it ever had. I should have turned away. I should have said goodnight. But I didn't. I stayed. And when the lights flickered and the first crash of thunder hit directly above us, the power snapped off. The house fell into darkness. We both froze. I could hear his breath, shallow and unsure, matching my own. "Do you have a flashlight?" I asked. He moved toward the closet. "Yeah, somewhere." I stepped back into the hallway, letting him search. The air was thick, humid, the scent of rain leaking in through the smallest cracks. I could hear water start to fall on the roof, a steady patter that quickly grew heavier. When he came out of the room, he held a flashlight. The beam cut through the hallway, making our shadows stretch long and strange. "Do you want me to light some candles?" he asked. I nodded. We went down to the kitchen together, quiet. The house felt different in the dark. Smaller. Closer. Like all the things we had been holding back were now sitting with us in every room, in every pause. We placed candles on the table, the counters, the stairs. The flames flickered, throwing soft light across the walls. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't theatrical. It just was. Eventually, we ended up in the living room, sitting on opposite ends of the couch. A candle burned low on the coffee table. The rain kept coming, heavier now, and the thunder shook the windows. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. And then, quietly, inevitably, we spent the night together. Morning arrived quietly, as though trying not to disturb what had just occurred. The storm had passed sometime during the night, leaving behind a stillness so thick I could feel it in my chest. The power was back, blinking clocks and humming appliances announced its return, but I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't want brightness. I didn't want the full weight of morning to fall just yet. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, still dressed in the clothes from the night before. My hands rested on my knees, palms open, as though I was waiting for something to fall into them. A thought. A sign. A reason. But all I felt was quiet. The house was motionless. I heard no footsteps. No doors creaking. No signs of life beyond my own breath. I didn't know if he was still asleep, if he had left, or if he was somewhere in the house avoiding the same things I was: confrontation, questions, the reckoning that now waited like fog at the edges of everything. I finally stood and went to the window. The sky was soft gray, smeared with streaks of early light. Trees glistened with raindrops. The lawn looked darker, heavy with water, grounded by the weight of the storm's passing. Everything appeared normal, washed clean, even. But inside me, nothing was. I made my way downstairs. My husband wasn't home. I hadn't heard him come in late, hadn't noticed the car return, and now I realized he'd likely spent the night elsewhere. A hotel. A friend's. Or maybe just in his office, lost in whatever had become more important than coming home. It should have mattered. It should have registered as betrayal. But all I felt was a hollow, quiet detachment, the kind that settles in after too much waiting, too much silence. It no longer surprised me. It no longer stung. I moved through the kitchen like I was floating, boiling water, preparing tea instead of coffee. Something gentler. Something that didn't demand so much of me. I didn't eat. I didn't want to. He came in as the kettle started to whistle. I didn't hear the door open this time, but I felt his presence before I turned. He stood in the hallway, looking unsure, his hair slightly tousled, his eyes still carrying the weight of the night before. We didn't speak. I simply turned off the stove and poured the tea into 2 mugs. I handed one to him without meeting his eyes. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where I had shared meals, conversations, birthdays, anniversaries. But now it was something else. A threshold. A place where things once built on foundation now cracked along invisible lines. We drank in silence. Eventually, he said, "Are you okay?" I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure I had the words. I wrapped my hands around the cup and stared into the steam, searching for something to say that wouldn't sound rehearsed or dishonest. "I don't know," I said finally. "I don't think I am." He nodded, like he'd been expecting it. "Neither am I." There was no regret in his voice. No apology. Just an acknowledgement of where we were now. I looked at him then, not with desire, not with shame, but with something softer. A kind of exhausted understanding. "What happens next?" he asked. I didn't know. Because what had happened between us wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't reckless or impulsive. It had been slow, inevitable, quiet. It had crept into the spaces left hollow by absence. And now, the weight of it was real. "I don't have answers," I told him. "Me either," he said. We sat there a while longer. The silence wasn't tense this time. It wasn't full of anticipation or dread. It just was. A resting place. A pause between 2 people trying to make sense of something that had grown too big to ignore. He stood first. He said he needed to go out, clear his head. I didn't stop him. I watched him walk away and heard the door close softly behind him. When I was alone again, I finally let myself breathe. It came out shaky. Uneven. Like my body wasn't sure it was allowed to relax. I moved to the living room and sat by the window. The clouds had broken slightly, letting in small beams of light that danced across the hardwood floor. I watched them flicker, trying to focus on something tangible. Something simple. But the questions kept pressing in. What did this mean for my marriage? For my life? For him? I thought about the vows I had made so long ago, standing in a white dress, hands clasped, promising forever. I remembered the way I had believed in that word, how I had wrapped myself around it like a shield. And now, forever felt like a house I still lived in but hadn't decorated in years. It was there, intact, but empty in places that used to be filled with color. The rest of the day moved slowly. I did laundry. I vacuumed. I stripped the bed and replaced the sheets. I watered the plants. All the while, I kept waiting for clarity, for some sign that would tell me what I was supposed to do. But it didn't come. When my husband returned that evening, he looked tired. He didn't greet me with a kiss or a question. He simply walked past me into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and poured himself a drink. We exchanged polite words about dinner. I asked about his day. He told me there had been traffic. It was also normal it hurt. We ate together. Then he disappeared into his study. Later that night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and studied my reflection. I looked the same. Same eyes. Same lines near the corners. Same tired expression. But something in my gaze had shifted. I didn't look away. I didn't pretend anymore. I wasn't the woman I had been a year ago. Or even a week ago. I turned off the light and stood there in the dark, letting the silence fill the space. Letting it say everything I couldn't. And I knew, without needing to speak it aloud. The life I had been living was no longer mine. And whatever came next would have to begin with that truth. The next few days passed in a blur of normality that felt almost surreal. I moved through them as if I were playing a part in a familiar production, speaking my lines, entering and exiting scenes with precision. On the surface, everything appeared intact, house clean, meals made, laundry folded. My husband resumed his usual pattern, early mornings, late nights, conversations that skimmed the surface of life like flat stones skipping across water. Not once did he ask me how I was. Not once did he look at me like he used to. But I wasn't expecting him to. Because something fundamental had changed in me. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't show in my posture or my tone. But it lived under my skin, deep and quiet and undeniable. And that made it harder to hide. Not from others, no one was really looking, but from myself. I tried to occupy my mind with tangible tasks. I reorganized drawers that hadn't been touched in years. I cleaned out the garage. I spent hours walking the aisles of grocery stores with no list and no urgency. But no matter how I tried to distract myself, the silence would always return. In the car. In the shower. In the small moments between moments, when I let my thoughts go unguarded. That's when I would see him. Not literally, but in memory. His eyes in the candlelight. His voice in the dark. The shape of his presence beside me when everything else had faded away. I didn't replay the details of that night, we had crossed no visible line, but I did relive the weight of it. The stillness. The decision that hadn't been spoken but had been made nonetheless. And I wondered if he felt the same. He didn't avoid me. He didn't seek me out either. We existed under the same roof with the care and caution of two people who understood exactly what had happened and how little could be said about it. There were glances, yes. Fleeting. Hesitant. But no words. Until Thursday. It was late afternoon. The house was quiet. My husband had texted earlier to say he would be home late again, some issue with a client, or maybe that was just the excuse of the day. I was sitting at the dining room table, going through old paperwork I didn't really need to organize. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me and knew instantly it was him. He didn't speak at first. Just stood near the doorway, waiting for me to acknowledge him. I looked up slowly and met his eyes. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. I nodded. We moved into the living room. I sat on the edge of the couch. He stood for a moment, then sat across from me, his hands resting on his knees, eyes scanning the floor like he was searching for the right words there. "I've been thinking," he said finally. "So have I." He looked up then, and our eyes locked. "I don't regret anything," he said. "But I don't know what to do with it either." I swallowed hard. "Me neither." Silence again. Not heavy. Not awkward. Just present. "I care about you," he said. "Probably more than I should." I didn't flinch. I didn't pretend to misunderstand. "And I think you care too," he added, softer now. I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them. "It's not that simple." "I know. That's the problem." We sat for a long time, neither of us moving. I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. The hum of the refrigerator. The distant bark of a dog 2 houses down. Ordinary sounds. Unchanged. Unconcerned with the magnitude of what sat between us. Are you afraid? I asked suddenly. He nodded. Yes. But not of what happened. Of what it means. I nodded too. Same. That was the closest we came to admitting the truth out loud. That whatever this was between us, it had already rooted itself deep enough to matter. He stood then, like the conversation had ended even though nothing had been resolved. I'm going for a walk, he said. Okay. I watched him leave, and the ache that followed surprised me. Not because it was new. But because I knew now that I didn't want to stop feeling it. It reminded me that I was still capable of being moved. Later that night, my husband returned home. He dropped his keys in the bowl by the door, kissed the top of my head, and asked what was for dinner. I told him. He grunted approvingly and disappeared upstairs to change. I stood in the kitchen, hands pressed flat against the counter, and tried to remind myself of who I had been. But the more I tried, the less I recognized her. At dinner, he talked about a new project at work. I listened, nodded, smiled in the right places. But inside, I was far away, walking through the park, the quiet streets, the hallway where our eyes had met just hours earlier. That night in bed, I couldn't sleep. I lay there beside the man I had built a life with, wondering if he would ever notice that I had already left parts of it behind. At one point, I rolled onto my side and watched the moonlight stretch across the bedroom floor. I counted the seconds between passing cars. I tried to find peace in the familiar shape of the room. But all I felt was distance. The next morning, I woke before dawn. I slipped out of bed quietly, not wanting to disturb him. I walked downstairs, made tea, and stood at the back door watching the first hints of light touch the edge of the trees. I thought about everything that had happened. The moments I didn't plan. The choices I didn't fully make, but allowed. And I knew, deep in my bones, that things couldn't go back. Not to how they were. Not even if I wanted them to. Because the truth had arrived, quietly, steadily. And it had changed everything. The day began without ceremony. No grand realization, no jolt of clarity. Just the soft rhythm of a life that no longer fit the way it used to. I rose before the sun, the sky still blue-black outside the bedroom window. My husband slept soundly beside me, unaware of the weight I carried, the silent unraveling that had taken root over the weeks, coiling itself into every part of me. I didn't want to wake him. Not because I feared a conversation, but because I knew there wasn't one waiting to happen. We had long stopped talking about real things. We had settled into quiet survival, comfortable, efficient, but void of depth. We were living side by side, not together. And I had stopped pretending otherwise. Downstairs, the house was hushed. The coffee brewed while I stood in the kitchen, staring out at the backyard. The trees swayed gently, the early morning wind moving through them like a breath. I cradled the mug in my hands and leaned against the counter, letting the warmth bleed into my palms. I thought about everything that had happened. About the first touch. The accidental glances. The way my heart had stirred after years of silence. I had tried to rationalize it, to excuse it, to bury it. But the truth had made its home inside me. It wasn't about betrayal. It wasn't even about desire. It was about presence. About being seen in a house where I had become invisible. And now, I couldn't go back. He came down later that morning, barefoot, hair unkempt, eyes heavy. He moved quietly, cautiously, as though uncertain how close to stand. I offered him coffee, and he took it, sitting across from me at the table. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. There was no tension now, just the awareness that something had come to its natural conclusion. "I'm leaving," he said. The words were soft, but they echoed. I didn't ask where. I didn't ask for how long. I simply nodded. "I think it's better," he added. "For you. For both of us." I swallowed hard. "I know." He looked around the room, his gaze settling on the familiar, the vase on the counter, the stack of unopened mail, the framed photo on the wall. It struck me then how temporary everything had become. How something that once felt like a home could turn into a waiting room for endings. "I didn't mean to make things complicated," he said. "You didn't," I replied. "They already were." We sat in silence a little longer. Then he stood, slowly, carefully, as if trying not to disturb the fragile balance of the moment. "If it ever feels like too much," he said, "just take care of yourself first." I nodded again. My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. He walked to the hallway, picked up his bag, and paused at the door. He didn't look back. And I didn't stop him. The door closed behind him with a finality I wasn't prepared for, but knew I needed. The house felt different after that. Larger, somehow. Every sound echoed longer, every room seemed a bit colder. I wandered through it, touching furniture I hadn't thought about in years, running my hand along picture frames and windowsills. Everything was still in place, but none of it felt grounded anymore. Upstairs, my husband was getting ready for work. I heard drawers opening, closet doors closing, the shower running. I walked past the staircase and stood in the hallway, listening to the routine of a man who still believed everything was as it had always been. I wondered if he would ever notice. By the time he came downstairs, dressed and polished, I was sitting in the living room with the television off. He kissed the top of my head without comment and grabbed his keys from the hook by the door. "Long day ahead," he said. I smiled faintly. "Be safe." He left, just like always. And I remained, surrounded by the quiet. That afternoon, I found myself in the guest room. His room. The bed still made, the drawers mostly empty, save for a few things he hadn't taken. I sat on the edge and stared at the wall, letting the silence settle around me. I opened the top drawer and found a folded note. My name on the outside. I held it in my hands for a long time before opening it. It wasn't long. Just a few lines. But it said everything. Asterisk, this wasn't a mistake. Not for me. But I know life doesn't always allow space for the things we need. I hope one day you find that space. Even if I'm not in it. Asterisk. I folded it back and placed it in the drawer. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves scattered across the lawn. The clouds moved low and slow, a heavy gray blanket stretching across the sky. I closed the window and leaned against the frame, watching the branches sway. In the evening, my husband returned home. He talked about meetings, traffic, the usual noise of everyday life. I listened. I responded. But I felt like a ghost inside a shell of conversation. Later that night, we sat on the couch watching the news. He rested his hand on my leg like he always had. I didn't pull away. I didn't lean in. I just sat there, quiet, still, fading. When it was time for bed, he turned off the lights and went upstairs. I remained in the dark, watching the flicker of car headlights pass through the window, dancing across the walls like brief visitors. I thought about the years behind me. The versions of myself I had abandoned. The promises I had kept. The ones I had broken. And I wondered how many lives a person could live inside one lifetime. When I finally went to bed, I lay awake for hours, listening to the breath of the man beside me. Steady. Unchanging. And I made a quiet decision. Not for anyone else. Not out of guilt. Not out of anger. But for myself. Because I had spent too long silencing my own voice. Too long waiting for someone to notice what had been missing. And now I knew it had to begin with me. Whatever that meant. Whatever came next.